Today I'm going to build a table that I designed about 3 years ago. You may or may not remember, but about 2 years ago I did a video on experimenting with different kinds of wood bleach. That experiment was for this project, a new kitchen table for my new house. The inspiration for my design came from a picture I saw of a coffee table by a designer named Nathan Lindberg. I love the look of those big round legs, so I used that as my starting point and came up with this design. It has a more modern shape on top, and I decided to cluster the legs together, creating two solid legs with a brass footrest running between them. This looks like a simple project, but there are lots of small, fun, and challenging details. First thing I tackled was the top. The boards I got were too wide for my jointer, so I had to rip them down to even start the milling process. I know there are ways around this, but these boards were also just too heavy for me to handle. I was happy to get rid of that extra weight, and I'll end up using some of those cutoff pieces later. I'm using soft maple here for a few reasons. I plan on bleaching the whole project, and soft maple bleached really well when I did my experiment video. Soft maple is also a closed grain wood, meaning the surface will not have a texture that crumbs can catch in, like I experienced with an ash table I built. Soft maple is slightly less expensive than hard maple. It machines a lot better, and it's not really soft. On the Jenga scale, it's about as hard as cherry, so it was the perfect choice for this table. After face jointing, planing to thickness, and then squaring up one edge, I ripped all the boards to final width at the table saw, and I wasn't done yet. I left the boards to settle overnight and repeated the process to get out any warps or twists that occurred during the initial milling process off camera. I spent a good amount of time laying out the boards so the grain was pleasing to look at, and then it was time to prepare for the glue up. Instead of going through the whole spiel of why I'm using a domino here and the alternatives that you can use, let's talk about my bench. This is the first big project I'm building on this bench, and every time I got to use a new feature or figured out something else it can do, it was like opening up a birthday present. So you're gonna see me highlight a few of those features in this video, and I'm sure in my future videos, because it's just so fun. I've learned from previous projects that gluing in dominoes takes up more time than I think it's gonna take, so to alleviate some stress from the actual glue up, I glue the dominoes in place beforehand. That way, when I glue these boards together, I'm not worried too much about the 20-minute open time. I also chose to split the glue up in half for this reason. The whole top is made up of 6 boards, so I did 2 glue ups of 3 boards each. Besides for the open glue time stress, I was also worried about the weight of this top. This is 8-quarter maple. Each board alone is very heavy, and I was getting flashbacks to when I dropped my maple workbench top and sprained my ankle. So I was going to take every precaution possible to make it easier on myself. Both halves are looking good and they can be joined together. I couldn't even lift one half of the top, so with this little cart and some leverage, I got both halves on the bench. Placed spacers underneath so I can pass clamps through and glue them together. This was seriously the least stressful glue up I've had in a very long time because I took it slow, but now it's way too heavy for me to flip and work on. So I had to wait till my muscle came home. And I had to think very methodically on the order of operations moving forward because I didn't want to have to wait for him to come home in order to keep working on this project. So everything I'm doing now is just on the underside of the table. I had to Google the name of the shape I'm creating. In the math world, it's called a stadium, but in the design world, it's just called a pill shape, where a rectangle is capped off with semicircles. This shape is super simple to make with a circle cutting jig. The max radius that you can cut with the accessories that come with my 6-in-1 trim router jig is about 18 inches. But I needed a 21-inch radius for this 42-inch wide top. Not a problem, I just made longer extension arms and I was able to cut 2 perfect 21-inch semicircles, creating a table that's 8 feet long. I could continue to use a circle jig and take multiple passes to final depth, but I find it easier to just get the shape started with the circle jig and then cut off the waste with a jigsaw. If you're gonna do this with a super thick top like this one, just make sure you get the longer blades. Also make sure not to cut right into your brand spanking new workbench. Well, at least I got the first ding over with. Anyway, I like to use this spiral flush cut bit that has a bearing on the bottom to clean up the rest. For normal projects, I would usually flip the workpiece over and clean it up with the router on top. But husband isn't home, so awkward upside down router dance it is. The edge profile I'm going to create is called a bullnose, and they make bullnose router bits of different sizes specifically for this task, but I don't have one, so I'll use a roundover bit. There was a slight complication of completing the bullnose on top because of the bearing, but I figured out a cool solution. I'll get to that in a bit. Before I could work on the top, I did a final sanding and applied finish. Since this is the underside, no one is ever going to see it, so I don't have to go through the whole bleaching process that I'm going to do on the top. I just applied a white wax finish and waited for my assistant to come home, and he helped me flip it so I continued to work. I started using the roundover bit on top and then realized at final cut depth, the bearing would fall on the already cut radius on the bottom, so it would cut deeper than I wanted it to. It was a simple fix though. I replaced the stock bearing with a larger bearing from this rabbiting bit set. This larger bearing is now able to run along the inset curve on the bottom, creating a perfectly shaped bullnose edge. This method did leave a thin line of excess wood in the center of both those cuts, which was easily cleaned up with a block plane. Super smooth. Speaking of smooth, time for sanding those edges. I put a soft sanding pad on my sander and just went to town. The hardest part was the end grain, but after a ton of elbow grease, it was looking pretty great. All right, let's start the bleaching process. Heads up, it's a process, but in my opinion, totally worth it. The bleach solution is water-based, so I popped the grain with water before sanding to final grit. After it dried, I knocked down any fuzzies that popped up. The wood bleach experiment video I posted 2 years ago goes into all the details on how to do this process, but basically, I'm making my own 2-part bleach solution using lye and hydrogen peroxide. The solution is equal parts of both, and then it gets applied. There are 2-part bleaching systems that you can purchase that are made up of the same ingredients that I'm using here. The problem is they're hard to find in stores, and the shipping prices are exorbitant because they're hazardous materials. There are also lots of tutorials on how to apply bleach like this. I chose to follow the instructions that were listed on one of the more popular 2-part bleach brands called Dailies. They say to apply 1 coat, let it dry, then come back 20 minutes later and apply a 2nd coat. They say if you desire a whiter color, you can do another bleaching session the following day. Google told me that putting the bleach object in the sun will enhance the bleached color. I actually don't think this made a difference at all. At this point, all the color is taken out of the wood, but it's still not white like I wanted. So I topped it with the Osmo White Wood Wax finish. You can still see all the grain in the wood, but all the color is taken out. I think it's such a cool look, and at the end, I'll show you what this wood with this exact finish process would look like without bleaching it first. The white wood wax looks nice, but it's not the most durable, so I top it off with Osmo Pollux oil in the raw color. I did 2 coats here for extra protection, waiting a day between each coat. As I'm meticulously applying multiple coats of finish, envisioning the countless family gatherings and meals this table will witness, I want to take a moment to talk about something equally essential to our daily lives: quality ingredients for our meals. Enter this week's sponsor, Thrive Market. Thrive Market is an online membership-based grocery store on a mission to make healthy living easy and affordable for everyone with guaranteed savings on every order. I've already saved over $120. That's pretty awesome. You can shop for thousands of the best-selling organic foods and natural products below traditional retail prices. If you find a better price elsewhere, they'll match it. Now, I was genuinely excited to explore Thrive Market's vast selection of unique snacks and products that I hadn't seen anywhere else. My kids have already requested some refills, and I can see why. From snacks and groceries to supplements, eco-friendly cleaning supplies, non-toxic beauty items, and even organic kids products, Thrive Market has it all. But what sets Thrive Market apart, in my opinion, is their user-friendly website that allows you to filter products by diet or lifestyle. Whether you're gluten-free, vegan, keto, or like me, keeping a kosher home, you can easily find what you need. With over 90 diets and values to choose from, it's a game changer. Thrive Market offers 2 membership options: a month-to-month membership and a yearly membership for just $59.99. That's only $5 a month. I opted for the 12-month option because Thrive Market guarantees that you'll save at least the the amount of your annual membership fee. And if you don't, they'll credit you the difference. Plus, your membership is risk-free. So if you decide within 30 days that Thrive Market isn't for you, simply cancel and get a full refund. So if you're ready to experience the convenience and savings that Thrive Market offers, click the link in my description box below or go to thrivemarket.com/Tamar to get 30% off your first order and a free gift worth up to $60. Thanks, Thrive Market. Now on to building the base. Same as the top, the base will be made from soft maple that I got from Woodworker Source. I love getting my groceries and my lumber delivered. Just so much easier. The table will have 2 legs. Each leg will be made up of 4 cylinders, and each cylinder will be made up of 4 pieces of wood. So that's a total of 32 pieces I need to mill. It was a lot of work. I often see people glue up octagons to make large columns like these, and that might be the right or correct way to do it, but I decided to go a different route so I didn't have to make any angled cuts, and so the glue up process would be easier. Each cylinder will have 2 large outer pieces and 2 smaller 1.5-inch wide pieces sandwiched in between. I tried to make it look like all these parts came from the same board. In most cases, the larger outer boards did, so I numbered them before milling to make sure they stayed together. But the smaller 1.5-inch pieces that will be sandwiched came from totally different boards, so I just tried to visually match the grain as best as I could. I left a gap in the middle to save on material, but there needs to be some wood in the middle so I can chuck these easily onto my table saw lathe, and adding wood in the middle will also help when I do the final assembly with screws, but it's best not to screw into end grain. So I cut up a few extra 1.5-inch wide boards I milled earlier and glued them back together. I know this seems odd, but I wanted at least 2 to 3 inches for the screw to grab onto when assembling, and if I would have just cut the 1.5-inch boards to this desired length, the end grain would be exposed. Remember, I want face grain for screw strength. I could have milled up a wider board to cut these, but these were already the correct thickness and it took like 2 minutes to do. Problem solved, ready for the glue up. I was able to fit 4 legs on my clamps at a time to make this more efficient, and it all went pretty smoothly. The most important thing to be aware of with this glue up was putting those glued up cubes in the correct orientation because they were slightly wider than they were thicker. Other than that, it was smooth sailing. I don't think gluing up 8 octagons would be as easy as this was. I milled all these extra long, so I really didn't care about lining up all the ends too much. I figured I would just trim them after the glue up, but I really didn't think this through. These were like 5.5 inches square, and I struggled for a bit to think about how I was going to accurately make such a large cut, and I always seemed to forget about the bandsaw. I had to set up a roller stand off to the side for support and use a miter gauge, but this totally worked to trim off those ugly ends. It wasn't the cleanest cut, and there's slight inconsistencies between all the pieces, but I'm just getting these to rough length at this point. Before I can chuck these onto my table saw lathe, I want to remove as much material as possible, so I set the table saw to 45 degrees and cut off all those corners as close to the circle as possible. You may or may not recall, but I did this cut for the round legs on my daughter's bed, and I had a close call with kickback, so I was really nervous to do it again. But I realized what caused the kickback that time. I was putting a lot of pressure on those pieces as I was pushing them through, and it caused the blade to flex down a bit, which then caused the offcut to catch on the front of the blade. So when I was passing these big blanks through, I made sure to have a very light touch, especially at the end of the cut. And I made it through all 8 of these blanks without any incidents. A little bit of prep before I can use the table saw lathe. I marked the centers on both ends of all the legs and drilled holes on those marks, then swapped out to a flat top grind blade. I also had to make a slight adjustment to my jig. The blanks I made were like 1/4 inch too big for the jig, so I double side taped some 1/4 inch plywood to the edges of the miter slots, which lifted up the whole jig while still being able to use the existing runners. Okay, this part is always so nerve-wracking. I've never turned 30-inch long legs before on this jig, so I procrastinated big time before making this first cut. Here's the basic idea behind the jig. A blank of wood is secured by its ends using bolts. Those bolts are able to spin freely in a block on the jig because they're inserted through bearings. The back of the jig gets locked into place with knobs, so the blank is really trapped in there. It cannot escape. I use a nut driver in my drill to rotate the front bolt as I run the whole jig through the table saw. At this point, I set the blade pretty low. For the first blank, I'm just sneaking up on my cut to dial in the right height. So I keep raising the blade until I get a perfectly round cylinder. While it's still in the jig, I can rotate it with the drill and sand all the saw lines off so it's really completely smooth. The first one is the hardest one to do. The nerves building up to do it and dialing in the blade height to get the exact diameter you desire. The rest are super easy. I leave the blade height as is and make a full depth cut in one pass. Then a quick sand and it's done. I know this looks super sketchy, but I promise it's not. It's the same principle as doing a cove cut on the table saw. There's just the added thrill of throwing a spinning object into the mix. I mean, lathes are pretty dangerous too. I do eventually want to get a lathe because I think it'll give me the ability to add really cool details to my projects, but I was able to make 8 identical large cylinders in no time at all, so this jig is great for batching out parts. It's also super satisfying to watch it take shape before your eyes. I was pretty pleased with myself here, managed to make all these without incident, but I'm not out of the woods yet. I still have to figure out how to join them all together like I planned in my design. Flat surfaces are easier to join than curved surfaces, so I'll need to make a jig to hold these round parts and trick them into thinking they're square. The rounds are held in place with 2 screws from either end. Then I pass the whole thing over the jointer one time to create a small little flat area on the curved surface. I made the ends of the jig shorter than the sides so I can see the end grain of the rounds. I want to make sure that the glue joints are running straight up and down on both ends before I screw it in place. So I adjust and rotate the round until the lines are perpendicular with the table, and then I screw it down and pass it through the jointer. I couldn't just flip the whole jig over to joint the other side because the jig was being cut with each pass also, and I wanted to make sure that there's always something stable on the bottom for it to run along. So I had to unscrew it after each cut and rotate the round inside the jig to cut the other side of each piece. That's why lining up those glue lines was so important. I needed to make sure that the flat was on the exact opposite side of the rounds so that when they're put together, the whole assembly will be straight. To assemble it all, I'll use dominoes. Making layout lines on this round object proved to be a bit difficult, but I worked it out. I made a story stick to line up with the bottom of each piece and made all the corresponding marks and extended them with a square. I thought I could use this center finder to mark the centers, but with a pencil in place, it just wouldn't stay stable on the curved edges. It kept rocking side to side. So I marked where the center is on the edge of my center finder and easily transferred the lines that way. The rounds that had flats on both sides were easy to hold down in place because there was a flat referencing the table. For the end pieces, which only had one flat milled on them, I discovered a fun, unintended use for the gap stop on my bench. These rounds were super stable in the gap, and I quickly cut all those mortises. Seriously, like unwrapping a birthday present. There's still a little bit of work that needs to be done to all these pieces before I can finish them. And I want to be able to finish them separately because of the tight crease in between each part. So I assembled each leg with dominoes temporarily, meaning no glue was added at this point. When I cut the blanks to length at the bandsaw, it was just a rough cut. So everything needs to be cut to final length now. I figured the best way to do this would be a router sled. So I started making a new jig. I glued a thin piece of plywood to the face of another piece of wood with a small little spacer underneath. I'm essentially making a rabbit here by adding material instead of removing material. Now, I thought I was going to be making a whole new jig to make this sled, but as I was doing this, I realized I could use the same jig that I used on the jointer to make the flats. So I glued those rabbited pieces to the top of the jointer jig, and now I have a perfectly sized router sled. Marking a straight square line across all these pieces was proving to be a bit difficult. So I had to make my own square that would sit flat on the curved leg, and then I could strike a line across. Now I could put on the flattening sled using the line I just made as a guide. I set the bit height so that it was just a hair above the rabbet on the jig and flattened away. The whole rabbit situation probably makes a little more sense now because you're seeing it in action. There needs to be a bit of a gap between the workpiece and the jig, or else the router will eat up the edge of the jig. I was super happy with how well this worked out. The cut was smooth, even, and best part, square. In order to ensure the opposite end will be cut perfectly parallel to the first end, I used spacers from the floor to line up the jig instead of marking a straight line across. I thought of so many ways to cut all of these pieces to final length, like a circular saw from both sides, but I was worried about lining up the cut perfectly on both sides, and these pieces were also too thick for a circular saw to even cut all the way through. There would be a little bit of material left over in the middle that I would have to attack with a handsaw. So I was really thrilled when I thought of this idea, and it worked out perfectly. It was pretty fun too. The spacers were also the perfect solution for ensuring both legs were the exact same height, since they're just referencing the floor. I love how simple this was. This was my first time using the 6-in-1 jig as a flattening sled, and I'm totally gonna use it more often. This was a great feeling. The moment both pieces are brought together and I could feel that they're indeed the exact same height throughout the width. While the pieces are still temporarily together, I rounded over the edges just on the bottom and used a chisel to get into that corner to complete the cut. Now I can disassemble the legs and do all the finishing touches, like final sanding with a soft pad on the sander to follow the contours of the round pieces, and hand sanding all the edges smooth. I'll be finishing these the exact same way I finished the top. So I water popped the grain before the final sand, taped up the flats that I'll get glue later, and did the whole bleaching process over again. That's 2 coats, 20 minutes apart, then another 2 coats, 20 minutes apart the following day. Some fuzzy still popped up after the application, and I thought I came up with this awesome invention, the glove sander, but I Googled and it exists already. Before I continue the rest of the finishing process on those, I need to make the pieces that I'll use to attach the legs to the table. I took whatever material was left over and milled it up into 2 pieces that will be bigger than the whole leg assembly so it can be screwed to the underside of the table. They didn't need to be so thick, and I didn't want to turn all this maple into dust, so I resawed the pieces to the thickness I wanted, and now I have veneer to play with for another project. I quickly cleaned them up with the planer and then mimicked the shape of the tabletop by roughly knocking off all the corners at the bandsaw. After drilling the hole for the pivot point, it's really easy to set the 6-in-1 jig to cut the perfect size semicircles for this shape. Just insert the pin in the hole and adjust until the edge of the router bit reaches the end of the board. This easily makes a perfect cut that can be cleaned up with a flush trim bit. Right side up this time. I shaped the bottom of these attachment pieces with a chamfer bit at the router table and brought in some of that scrap I cut off way back when this video started to make stretchers that will connect those attachment pieces I just made. I jointed one face, then I jointed one edge. I ripped to width, then cleaned up the opposite face. Now I can resaw these boards into 2 boards at the bandsaw and bring them to the exact same thickness at the planer. This next segment is called Let's Watch Tamar Make Her Life Difficult Just for the Fun of It. There's absolutely no reason why these stretchers needed to be joined to the attachment pieces with a dovetail half lap. This could have been done in 5 minutes or less with the domino, but here we are. I angled the blade to roughly 12 degrees, then made cuts on each end using a stop block on this sled I quickly whipped up. Then I squared the blade back up and used a stop block again to make the repetitive cuts that remove all the waste, creating the dovetail shape. There was a teeny tiny little bit of material left over in the corner of the joint that I was able to quickly pare away for a really clean looking cut. And now I can lay these stretchers on the attachment pieces to mark out for the mortises. I like using the dust collection port on my router, but it really inhibits my view of the cut. So I tried my best to do a rough cut by staying close to the green tape, but I really couldn't see and I was scared I would go over the line, so I changed gears and created this 3-piece template that I lined up on my marks. Now I can use a pattern bit to create the shape, and this was definitely easier and a lot less stressful. I used the actual stretcher to set the bit to the correct depth, and voila, all cut. Now I'll spend some quality time with my chisels to square up all those corners the round router bit leaves over. No one is ever going to see this joint. There is really no reason for me to be doing this right now other than the fact that I thought it would be fun. And I guess I thought it would be good practice too. In the end, I kind of really wish that this joint was visible because I think I did a really good job on it. The whole purpose of this was to make assembly day go smoothly. These two parts are going to act like one, and even without glue, it holds together super strong. This assembly will be attached to the underside of the table and the legs using screws through oversized holes. So I marked out all those locations, disassembled it all, and got to drilling. First I drill with a Forstner bit deep enough that it'll hide the head of the screws I'm going to use. Then I'll drill all the way through using a bit that's wider than the screws I'm going to use. I sanded all the parts and got to have a bit of fun with this new cornering tool. So much more fun than setting up a router. I'm definitely going to be using this more often. I thought for a really long time on whether or not I should glue these in, decided there was no reason not to, so I went ahead with the glue up. There's just something about knocking a joint into place. I spent half a day making those when I could have just gone the simple 5-minute domino route, but this really added a lot of joy to this project for me, and that's what it's all about. The whole purpose for this piece is to make assembly day go smoothly. So with the tabletop flipped upside down, I placed it so that it was dead on center from the edges and ends, then clamped it into place using cawls. Once in place, I drilled holes that went all the way through the underside of the table on both attachment pieces. I'm going to use these holes for alignment when it comes to assembly time. So I made sure to mark corresponding numbers so I know how it's all supposed to line up. I milled a dowel to the same size as the hole using a dowel plate, then cut it down into 4 little pieces using my gap stop as support as I cut. I chucked those little dowels into my drill, rounded over one end with sandpaper, double-side taped to my bench, and then glued them into the holes drilled on the underside of the table. I realized at this point I didn't put the final coat of finish on the bottom, so I added another coat and finished all the leg pieces the same way I finished the top. The wood wax finish in white, and then the Pollux oil in the raw color, waiting a day between applications. Then I waited another day for it to cure a bit so I can glue all the parts together. I tried to use as little glue as possible so I didn't have to deal with any squeeze out, but of course I didn't succeed and had to scrape some glue out of the crevices, which was not fun. But it made me realize how smart I was for putting finish on it all before attaching them together. Almost there. The last thing missing is the brass tube for the footrest. You may have noticed this cardboard tube in the corner of my shop since I moved in. I ordered this 2-inch brass tube for this project in July of 2022. Crazy. I cut it down to size and drilled the holes for it in the legs with a 2-inch Forstner bit. I originally thought I would use a router template and a router to cut these holes, but that was literally impossible to do. So I made a hole the same size as the shank of the bit and used that as a guide to keep it straight as I cut. I would say this worked out okay. I think it would have been better if I used a thicker board as my guide so it didn't flex and I would drill a bit straighter. Either way, I couldn't get to final depth with that setup, so I removed the jig and used the already drilled out portion to guide me straight down to final depth. I repeated the process on the second one. It was a perfect fit. But I had to disassemble it to clean and polish up the brass, then spray on a few coats of brass lacquer to prevent it from tarnishing. All parts are done, and now it's ready to assemble. Each leg is brought into place. Then the brass rod is inserted. And I chose not to epoxy or glue this in case I ever want to disassemble the table. Next, the stretcher attachment assembly gets placed on top and it will be attached to the legs with these lag bolts. This is why I went through the trouble of making sure the middle block was face grain and not end grain. Those screws will hold onto the wood super securely now. I attached the other side and the whole thing felt so solid. Time for the top. I take note of the numbers marked on the underside, but no playing around with the location, making sure there's an even overhang all around and all that mess, because the dowels drop right into the holes drilled on the attachment pieces. Love it. Top is in the right place and I just have to lock it all down with screws and all the holes I drilled out so it doesn't budge, and it's done. I've had this design in my head for so many years. It was a really special feeling to finally see it in the real world. I'm kind of obsessed with the bleach finish. I love that all the wood grain is still visible while still being a very light, bright white color. As promised, here's what the same wood would look like doing the exact same finishing process minus the bleaching. It looks pretty white at first, but when you compare it to the bleached table, there's a pink undertone to the wood. That's what the bleaching removes. That non-bleached maple is a very nice look. I actually really love it, but not for this project or this space in my house. It just doesn't go with the other colors I have going on. I think the brass footrest is my favorite thing. I almost didn't add it because I was scared to drill into the legs. So happy I mustered up the courage. It was also pretty courageous of me to turn these legs on the table saw lathe, and it was worth it 100%. I took that inspiration picture and turned it into something I can call my own. A dining table is the heart of the home, and I am so proud to have created this beautiful piece that my family will gather around to share multiple meals a day for years to come. L'chaim. Thanks again to Thrive Market for sponsoring this video, and thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.